Hi, and welcome to this week's live event. I'm Ailsa Kepi, and I'm curator of the group Women Healing from Emotional Abuse with Power, Passion, and Pleasure. And you can watch a free live webinar on the 5 shifts that you need to make to overcome some of the long-term effects of emotional abuse. This is available if you go to www.ailsakepi.com. You can sign up. It's available on the hour, every hour during the day, absolutely free. I suggest you take advantage of that as a resource as well. But today here in the group we're talking about, is trauma treatable? This is a huge topic, of course, and we're just going to touch on a few ideas around this topic because a lot of us are throwing around the idea that, trauma, I'm traumatized and therefore, I have this illness or this thing that I can't change. And I think what I would really love to offer you as an option is that trauma in and of itself can be a catalyst for change. It can be a catalyst for us to look deeper within ourselves, to integrate some of the parts of ourselves that haven't been integrated before, and to actually move beyond living life from a traumatized place, a place where we're just triggered over and over, where we recreate our trauma, all of that kind of thing, and that we can actually have some autonomy and some choice around what we do with our lives and how we live, and especially our relationships. So one thing, there's a few things I just want to say, and this may not all come out exactly in the right order, but the usual person that goes for therapy, the traumatized patient's a little bit different. We have to remember that a person that's carrying around a dissociated trauma experience, the integration or wholeness, like actually healing, is one of the scariest things for them. Quite often, it's like the worst thing imaginable would be to actually have to face that trauma. And we've learned over many years, quite often, to split off from the feelings, to split off from even the thought of what happened. Sometimes we don't even remember what happened. Sometimes we live in a fantasy creation that we find much more amenable to us, that much more self-soothing than an actual reality. Sometimes we have addiction, sometimes we do all sorts of things to not want to integrate what's happened to us and how we could move through that. And so quite often, and I find this as well, is that people will say, yeah, I want to heal, I want to not be triggered, I want to get over having PTSD or all these things, but when they come up against any kind of healing, all of a sudden it's too hard, it's too difficult, they're coming up against these huge blocks, and these blocks are actually what were self-serving, self-protective mechanisms in our psyche, in our entire being. Often when we were kids, especially if you had trauma as a child, ongoing trauma particularly, you developed these ways of coping with it as a child that kind of rise up and protect you from actually going there. And so, these protector, persecutor parts of ourself are often so ingrained in our bodies that we find it really difficult to deal with. And I wanted to actually bring up, there's a really awesome example of this. If any of you have watched the film Tolkien, he was the writer of The Lord of the Rings. And if you've been to see his life story, he had lost both his parents as a child, first his father and then his mother, and, he had difficult time with that. And then he was in World War I, of course, hugely traumatizing experiences there too. And, he came back and he was married, and he worked through, and you can see this in his writing, he worked through these kind of mythical battles in his story about the Lord of the Rings. And, it was kind of this this ability to tell it as a story, to kind of symbolize all these forces that were working within him as a story that made sense, and to externalize it like that and symbolize it and work through it, I think actually led to him healing a lot of his PTSD, and I think he was the only one out of his group of friends that actually kind of didn't end up either depressed, crazy, or dead. You know, and that's kind of an extreme example, but we can see how, you know, those huge forces within ourself is kind of what's battling in our body. Like, we want to heal, and then this protective part of us like battles with that. No, we can't go there. It's too dangerous. It's too scary. It's too painful. So we have this kind of inner battleground going on, which makes it quite difficult for traditional therapy to work with trauma. And I think this is why a lot of people that are traumatized and they've tried traditional therapies have found that it hasn't really touched on anything, or after a while they're like, oh, this isn't working, I don't want to do it. You know, they get kind of their defense mechanisms come up, and they decide that it's not for them, or they don't have the money, or whatever it is. They get out of doing the work. And often the therapist is not trained to work on this kind of archetypal level to really deal with, you know, some of these inner beings that we create in order to survive childhood trauma. They're within us, and they're very huge, like mythical beings, and they have a lot of energy. And our ego, as in, you know, we can effort to try and overcome our addictions or our whatever, and somehow we just can't do it because these forces are really big. And so one thing that is super important, if you know, if you're looking for someone to help you work through traumatic events in your past, is that you and whoever you choose to work with, whether that's someone like me as a coach, or someone as a therapist, or you know, a body worker, even somebody who's able to hold space and help you create a safe physical space and a safe interpersonal environment. So the relationship, you begin to trust this person as a relationship. And this is, of course, one of those things, you know, trusting in a relationship is one of those things that comes up as really difficult for those of us that have had emotional abuse. And so, you know, this requires a really understanding therapist and working together, and, you know, an awareness that this is going to be difficult and that you have to give this relationship a chance with the correct person. So it's a whole difficult dance right at the beginning. But, you know, then dreams and your fantasies and your inner world can start to emerge, and you can start to work with this. So we can kind of work with it in a more playful way. And this is a lot of what my program with women works with, is the creative arts, the movement, the body awareness. You might have heard me use the term somatic, the somatic arts, somatic movement awareness. It means really starting to feel into our body. So we start to create some words that have meaning for these huge feelings that are going on inside us. Because another thing that happens, especially with really early childhood trauma, is that there's actually a word, and it's called alexithymia, which means you have no words for the feelings that you have. You can't bring it up. And so, you know, this childhood trauma disconnects us from the affect, and, you know, we can't seem to connect things. So the reason I call my program The Body Leads the Way is because all of what's happened to us is kind of encoded, or the memories are in our body. And sometimes we can't actually recall stuff in our mind until we begin to work with the body and with the feelings and with what comes up in our dreams and what comes up in, you know, when we're working with feelings and sensations. So this is a big part of how we start to connect these pieces of ourself. And so what happens often is that, you know, when we have these huge mythical beings, you know, that are trying to keep us safe, and sometimes in trying to keep us safe, they stop us healing, they stop us working on ourselves. And what it leads to is this kind of hope. You have hope that something's going to work, and then you start to feel vulnerable in whatever situation, you know, if you're going to a yoga class even, or if you're going to see a therapist. And then, you know, you have the fear comes up around being vulnerable, and then you get a shame coming up over that. And then you begin to attack yourself. Well, maybe you're just not good enough. Maybe you just can't do this. Maybe they don't really care about you, and you don't have any business being here. All of those feelings start coming up. And this leads to eventually kind of a depression, because this cycle is so painful in and of itself. You keep having this hope, and then you're a failure, and goes round and round. So getting out of this cycle, requires that at some point we get off that circle of, going through that whole cycle as is, and we start finding the vulnerability and maybe staying with it just a little bit longer so we can find some compassion for yourself. And I put this in terms of, probably all of you are aware of like the story like Beauty and the Beast. Let's take a lot of these mythical stories. So these are use archetypes that are in our culture, that are whether you resonate particularly with these stories or not, they're in our culture. So in Beauty and the Beast, the beauty has to get to love the beast. And in that loving of the beast and finding compassion for the beast is transformed. And so when you think about our own inner kind of persecutor, protector, archetype that arises often in response to early trauma, we have to go within and actually find compassion for our own parts of ourself that are wounded, or parts of ourself that seem out of control, parts of ourself that seem animalistic or rude, or outspoken or angry, or all these things that we don't think are good or nice. We have to learn to love those parts of ourselves. And this is easy to say, not so easy to do, and hence working through something like my program that takes you step by step through how to do this is, really helpful. And I use stories and myths and things to do that as well. But what happens is every moment of intimacy or personal accomplishment that you achieve with, working on yourself gives an occasion for your inner persecutor, predator to come up and say, it'll all be taken away. You're an imposter. You're going to just be humiliated. This isn't going to work for you. And if some of you recognize those words, just recognize that this is a part of yourself that has been created because of trauma, probably, and because, it's trying to protect you from being hurt again. But in doing so, it's also kind of giving you trauma ongoing inside you. And so the only way that this can kind of come out is to be re-traumatized externally. And this is why also many people end up reliving traumatic situations, getting into another traumatic situation that's worse or whatever over and over again, because we already have this internal battle going on, and we're putting it out here to try and externalize it, to try and make sense of it, ends up just making us traumatized again. And so we have to find a way to really work with someone that we can just start to gently, really gently and humbly look at these parts of ourselves. The original traumatic situation was so dangerous to our personality survival when we were young that we didn't actually retain this in personal form. We just retained it in an archetypal form. Like I said, we create a monster inside of ourselves. And this is the kind of collective layer of the unconscious. And, we can't actually assimilate the trauma when it's in this archetypal kind of realm. We have to kind of make it manifest in this world. So we have to recreate some kind of traumatic situation, some kind of trigger to bring it up, in which case then we can work with it. So we have this experience of re-traumatization, which isn't, it's our psyche trying to bring it up so that we can work with it again. What we need to have is like a mentor, a guide, a trauma doula or something, however you want to call that person that is there to help you walk through those pieces. The unconscious repetition of traumatization in the inner world, which goes on incessantly, has to become a real trauma with an object in the outer world in order to unlock it. And that's kind of what we find. We're triggered, and that is the opportunity. That is a great opportunity to look at it. we have to create a relationship and a responsibility to know and work with these forces inside, and just be humble and realize how strong these forces are. They helped us survive at some point. And if any of you have experienced really severe trauma, these forces kept us, literally kept us alive. And so we don't want to disregard them, but we must create a relationship with them, as in Beauty and the Beast. She has to learn to love the beast, that kind of thing. That's why a lot of these stories include that kind of storyline. Yeah, we can't actually symbolize something that's so unbearable until much later. So if it's something like a sudden trauma, we can't actually process it at the time. And so through retelling slowly and carefully, sometimes you can, make sense of it. We can begin to metabolize it. But this childhood trauma kind of annihilates this whole architecture of ourselves to heal. And sometimes we get stuck with this internal battle. And this often creates this feeling that we get more attached to our fantasy life that we go to, because this life we can somewhat control, although it's debatable really whether we're controlling that. But we go into this fantasy life. And so, much of what I work with women when they first come into my program is to begin to really take a step back and look at this with the rose-colored glasses taken off, like really begin to see what's really happening, what's really there. How many times have we kind of belittled what trauma we've actually been through or what we're going through at the time. And, we make that it's okay. We go to our own place. Yes, we're fine. We're doing good, da, da, da. And, really we're not. So we have created kind of a nice compliant self, and we just have to have faith. The therapist that you work with, or the coach or the guide, has to have faith that there's so much complexity to life. It's not simply, happily ever after or evil and doom. There is such a complex mix that real life is, that we need to hold space for that. And often, as the guide or therapist, I have to hold that space, that faith that there is a meaning, there's a symbology to this real life experience that isn't perfect and isn't horrible. It's somewhere in the middle, and it has elements of both. And that's interesting, because a preference for fantasy over reality is perhaps the core problem in all addictions. I want you to listen to that again. The preference for fantasy over reality is perhaps the core problem in all addictions, is that we would want to believe what we want to believe more than we want to see what's really there. And I hear that over and over again in many people I talk to. And it's difficult. It takes a lot to really step back and see what's really happening. And it takes compassion for our beautiful inner self, child self, or however, that we have to find that place to open up the compassion for that, little girl, whatever, that has gone through, this situation. And if it was, somebody else, a little girl out there that had gone through what you've gone through, how would you feel about that? Would you be able to take that in? And can you bring that to your own self? These are all things that, I work with women and, in my program. And we just have we have a compulsive preference for self-soothing fantasies, and a refusal to live within human reality. And we don't want to suffer its limitations. We don't want to be in the reality, because it hurts. It has different, we have all these different emotions. It's complex. But this is what really living is, and the sweetness that a lot of you want, that joy, that peace, those kind of feelings that people come to me saying that's what they want, that's their intention for our work together. That is predicated on living in reality and being able to feel. And being able to feel is something that, is so beautiful and yet so exquisitely painful as well. And, we have to find the courage and the commitment to ourselves to do that. And we have to choose it. It's not going to heal by itself. So I just want to leave it there, I think, for today, but to leave you with the message that, choosing to commit to yourself with courage is the most precious gift you can give to yourself. And, have a look at my free webinar. If you feel ready to talk to me personally, I have 1 hour free breakthrough calls with me from anyone in this group. Please take advantage of that if you feel like you're ready to talk about your situation and how we might take a step forward with that. So go to www.ailsikhepi.com/apply and book a call with me, and let's talk about how this commitment and your courage and one step forward at a time could look for you. All right, it's been lovely talking to you. I think we have a topic for next week already, so I'll be announcing that in a few days. And please message what's your takeaway from this video. I'd love to hear about that. Take care. Thanks very much for listening.